I had been planning the trip for a while. Work had been killing me, and I needed something to reset my head. I didn't want a crowded campground, didn't want people playing music all night or kids screaming around my tent. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that feels like you're on another planet. So I dug into maps, satellite images, Forest Service websites. Eventually, I found a spot deep inside National Forest land, about 20 miles of rough dirt roads past the last paved highway. No cell service, no rangers on regular patrol. The closest official site was miles back, and that one only had 2 other people on the registry for the weekend, both nowhere near where I planned to go. I packed everything I needed to stay out there for 4 days. Tent, stove, food, bear canister, water jugs, extra batteries, satellite GPS in case things went sideways. I had a printed map with compass bearings marked out and the old paper kind of Forest Service map that folds 12 ways and never sits flat. I left a copy of my route with my brother and told him I'd check in Monday. I got to the trailhead a little after noon on Friday. I had to crawl my truck up a winding gravel road that had weeds growing up the middle and a couple tight switchbacks where the trees had almost reclaimed the edges. I dropped into low gear for most of it, just inching forward while branches scraped the sides and the suspension groaned. I saw no one, no tire tracks, no signs of recent traffic. It had rained 2 days earlier, and the road still showed the puddle scars from that. I parked in a tiny pull-off that could maybe fit 2 cars if they were both compact. Just beyond it, the road narrowed even more and eventually disappeared into brush. I hiked about a mile down from there to a clearing I'd picked out on the topo map. A flat patch not far from a small creek, surrounded by pine and aspen. It was perfect. I set up my tent with the door facing the trees and started boiling water for dinner. The air was crisp, maybe low 50s by sundown. No wind, no animal sounds except for the occasional crack of branches from squirrels or birds hopping around overhead. That first night, I slept well. Sometimes I don't the first night out, but this time the stillness helped. There's something calming about being that far from civilization. No buzzing power lines, no headlights, no cars in the distance. Just dark and quiet and cold. I woke once around 2 a.m., probably because I drank too much water before bed. I stepped out to take a piss, looked up at the stars, brighter than I'd seen in a long time, and crawled back in. Slept until almost 8. Saturday was uneventful. I wandered the woods nearby, found some old logging debris maybe half a mile uphill, sawed stumps and rusted cables wrapped around a downed tree. Could have been 40 years old. I saw deer tracks, scat, a couple rabbit holes. No sign of predators, no bear prints, no cat tracks. The ground here was a mix of hard dirt and old pine needles, good for hiking, not too much brush. I cooked some oatmeal, read for a while in the hammock I strung between 2 trees, and took a nap in the afternoon sun. That night, I built a small fire and sat near it until the sky turned black. No planes, no satellites, just stars and the shifting shadows of trees. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 10 and drifted off fast. At 3:13 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no animal outside, no wind, just my heart pounding like it knew something I didn't. I lay still for a minute. I could feel the cold now. It had dropped hard during the night, and I was zipped into my bag tight, only my nose out in the open. My ears started to pick up something faint. It was the crunch of gravel. At first, I thought I imagined it, but it came again. A slow, deliberate sound, like tires rolling over loose rock. Not close, but not far either. I turned onto my side and stared at the nylon wall of my tent, trying to pinpoint the direction. The road I had hiked in on was behind me and uphill. The sound was coming from there. The crunching grew louder, then stopped, then started again a bit closer. It wasn't fast like someone driving through. It was slow, like someone easing forward, maybe riding the brake, not wanting to make noise. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. My sleeping bag was loud, nylon always is, and it made a subtle swish as I moved. I reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. I didn't want any light giving away my position. The walls of the tent glowed faintly with starlight. The sound continued, off and on, maybe for 5 minutes. Then silence. I waited. I didn't breathe deep, didn't move. Nothing. No doors, no voices, no engines revving. No footsteps in the brush. Just nothing. Eventually, I laid back down, but I didn't sleep. I watched the ceiling of the tent go from black to gray as dawn came. I waited until I could see clearly without a flashlight before I stepped outside. The forest looked normal. Cold air, wet grass. My fire pit was undisturbed. But I walked uphill to the gravel road, heart pounding again. There were fresh tire tracks. I stared at them for a while. They came down from the way I'd driven in, turned at the little pull-off, and then stopped. Then they backed out, same set of prints, exact same tread pattern. No boot prints, no oil drips, no broken branches, just fresh tracks, still sharply edged in the gravel, not yet scuffed by wind or water. I followed them for a bit, maybe a quarter mile. No signs of a turnoff or parked vehicle. They came down, turned in, paused, and backed out. Nothing else. And they weren't there the day before. I would have seen them. I know because I had to park and pull around slowly to avoid a big rock that was still pushed to the side. Someone came through here at 3 in the morning, eased into my pull-off, sat there, then left. I didn't know what to do. I looked around, listening hard for any movement, but there was no one. I couldn't hear a thing except some birds starting up in the trees. I went back to camp slowly, checking the trail and brush around me, trying to see if someone had gone off-road on foot. Nothing. The pine needles were undisturbed. No broken twigs, no crushed moss. Back at camp, I made coffee. My hands were shaking. It wasn't the cold. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me felt that might be overreacting. Maybe it was someone lost, turning around. Maybe a hunter checking access. But what kind of hunter creeps up a forest road at 3 a.m. with their headlights off? There hadn't been a moon out. It was pitch black. I tried to get through Sunday like normal. Took a short walk. Didn't wander far. I kept scanning the tree line, looking for anything out of place. I stopped using my earbuds when I walked and left the fire burning longer than usual that night, just for the comfort of the light. I slept with my knife next to me and my bear spray clipped inside the tent. Didn't use earplugs like I normally do. Nothing happened that night, but I didn't sleep much either. Monday morning, I packed up fast. I didn't eat breakfast, just stuffed everything in the pack and hiked uphill to the truck. I stopped short when I saw the cab. There was a smudge on the passenger side window. It looked like a handprint, not full, not clear, but it was there, just a greasy streak where the light caught it. I'd wiped the inside of those windows clean before the trip. I always do because I hate how fast they fog up. I unlocked the door and checked inside. Nothing taken, nothing moved, but I still felt sick. I turned the key and backed out, watching the mirrors. I didn't drive slow on the way down. I pushed harder than I should have. The suspension groaned. The truck scraped once or twice, but I didn't care. I just wanted off that mountain. I didn't stop until I hit the first small town with a gas station and working cell signal. I checked my phone. No messages. I texted my brother to let him know I was safe and sat in the lot for a while. Engine off, door locked, just watching the pumps and the few cars that came through. I've done a lot of solo camping. That's how I clear my head. I've had close calls with weather, with animals, even with people once or twice. But this one shook me more than any of them. Not because something happened, but because nothing did. And I'll never know what would have happened if I'd gone outside at 3 a.m., if I'd left my headlights on, if I'd camped 50 yards further down the trail and hadn't heard a thing. I still camp, still go out alone, but I don't go as far anymore, and I always park facing out. We'd gone on dozens of camping trips before. It was kind of a family tradition. Every summer, we would pick out a new place to visit, load up the bikes, pack the tents, and bring the dog along for the ride. I loved those trips. There was something about the smell of pine trees, the crunch of gravel under the tires, the sound of birds singing early in the morning. It always made me feel at peace. I always thought of those trips as something safe, something familiar. This one started out no different. It was just another summer, just another campground, just another ride. We were camping somewhere near a lake, not far from the border between the US and Canada. The place was beautiful. There were tall trees everywhere, the kind that reached high into the sky and blocked out most of the sun. The trails wound through the woods like veins, some paved but most of them rough dirt and gravel paths that looked like they had been there for years, maybe even decades. The campground had connected to a long trail about 13 miles long, and we'd planned to ride a good stretch of it that day. It was me, my mom, my dad, my best friend, and our dog. The dog was a medium-sized mix, mostly shepherd with some other things thrown in. She was full of energy and always curious, but she usually stayed close by when we hiked or biked. We trusted her, though we always kept her on a leash just in case. That morning, the air was cool, the sky clear. We set out from the campsite with our bikes, my dad holding the dog's leash while he rode. It wasn't the safest setup, but we'd done it many times before and it always worked out. The dog would trot beside him, sometimes running a little ahead, sometimes slowing to sniff something, but never pulling hard or acting out. She just liked being part of the pack. The trail was rough. Not impossible, but definitely not smooth. There were roots poking out of the dirt in some places, loose gravel in others. Patches of it had eroded away, leaving the edges soft and crumbly. Some stretches hugged the lake tightly, the hill on one side sloping steeply down into the water. First, the ride was easy. We pedaled at a steady pace, stopping now and then to take in the view or let the dog sniff around. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. It was one of those rides where your mind kind of drifts, where you stop thinking about pedaling and you just ride. The trail began to get narrower the farther we went. I noticed that the edge closest to the lake was crumbling in some places, as if the ground had been giving way over the years, piece by piece. It didn't bother me at first. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the twists and bumps in front of me. The steep drop to the water was on my right side, and even though it looked sharp, it felt manageable as long as we stayed careful. We came to a part of the trail that was especially narrow, maybe 2.5 feet wide. On the left side, the dirt wall rose up at a sharp angle. It was rough, dotted with tree roots and small stones. On the right side, the hill dropped away, a long, steep slope of loose dirt and gravel that led straight into the lake. It wasn't just a gentle slope. It looked like it had caved away a long time ago, leaving behind a 70-degree angle. One misstep, and you wouldn't stop until you hit the water, probably rolling the whole way. I felt my stomach tighten as I looked at it, but I kept riding. There wasn't much room to turn around. The only way was forward. My dad was in front of me, holding the dog's leash in his left hand while steering with his right. He was always steady, always the one who stayed calm. I trusted him to handle it. I rode behind him, my best friend behind me, my mom bringing up the rear. The dog had been good all day, trotting along next to my dad, never pulling, never wandering off. But then something changed. I don't know what caught her attention. Maybe it was a bird. Maybe it was a small animal rustling in the bushes below. Maybe it was nothing, just that strange instinct dogs sometimes get to explore the most dangerous spots they can find. Whatever it was, she suddenly lunged to the right, pulling toward the edge of the trail. I watched her paws scramble for traction as she started to slide down the loose dirt. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. The dirt gave way under her feet, and her body tilted toward the slope. My dad jerked the leash, trying to pull her back, but that quick tug upset his balance. I saw his bike tilt toward the edge. His left foot came off the pedal as he fought to stay upright, but the leash was still pulling him toward the drop. Time seemed to slow down. I remember watching it like I wasn't even part of it, like I was just a spectator. I saw the front wheel of his bike hang over the edge for a moment. His body leaned dangerously to the right, the dog sliding down, his arms stretched out, trying to hold on to her. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in front of me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just watched, my hands frozen on the handlebars. I thought I was about to see both of them go over. If they had fallen, they wouldn't have stopped. The hill was too steep, too loose. It would have been a fast, brutal fall straight to the lake, probably bouncing off rocks and roots on the way down. I imagined broken bones, blood, the bike tumbling after them. I imagined my mom screaming, my friends scrambling to help. I imagined trying to climb down to them to see if they were still breathing. All of that flashed through my head in an instant, but somehow my dad didn't fall. He threw his weight hard to the left, away from the drop, and managed to plant his foot on the trail just in time. He yanked the leash, pulling the dog back toward him. She scrambled, her paws scrabbling at the loose dirt, and somehow she made it back up to the edge. My dad steadied himself, the front wheel still hanging over the side for a moment before he pulled it back onto solid ground. He adjusted the leash, tightened his grip, and without saying a word, started moving forward again, carefully this time, inch by inch. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My legs were trembling as I started pedaling again. I kept my eyes locked on the trail, watching every stone, every patch of loose dirt, every inch between me and the drop. I wasn't going to make a single mistake. Not here. Not now. We made it past that section and rode in silence for a long time. No one said anything. The sound of the tires crunching on gravel was the only thing I could hear. I think all of us were still processing what had almost happened. It wasn't like those near misses you laugh about later. This one stayed with me. Even after we finished the ride and made it back to the campsite, the image was stuck in my head. I kept seeing my dad's bike tilting toward the edge. I kept seeing the dog sliding down, the panic in her scrambling paws. I kept thinking about how easily it could have gone the other way. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The next morning, we sat around the picnic table, eating a quiet breakfast. I remember my dad's hands shaking a little as he poured himself some coffee. He didn't say much, but I could tell it had rattled him too. We never rode that part of the trail again. None of us wanted to go back. It wasn't worth the risk. There were plenty of other trails, plenty of other places to ride. That narrow strip with the steep drop, that one was done for us. Over the years, I've been on lots of bike rides, on better trails, on worse trails, but that ride stuck with me. It's not the kind of story you tell to get a laugh or to scare someone. It's the kind of thing you remember because it reminds you how fast things can go wrong. 1 second, you're enjoying the day. The next second, you're standing at the edge of something you can't control. People think of camping and biking as safe, peaceful things. Most of the time, they are. But nature doesn't care about your plans. Trails crumble. Dogs pull. A second of bad luck is all it takes. Even now, I can still picture that hill. I can still see the loose dirt sliding under my dog's feet. I can still see my dad leaning over the edge, fighting for balance. I can still feel that helplessness, knowing there was nothing I could do but watch. It's a memory I carry with me, a reminder of how quickly a simple day can turn into something else entirely. And that trail, I never went back. I never even wanted to. Some places are better left alone. I went camping with my roommates once. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away, something simple to break up the routine. We didn't plan anything fancy, just some tents, a campfire, and a chance to get out of the city for a bit. There were 4 of us, me and 3 of my roommates. We weren't exactly wilderness experts, but we knew enough to handle a basic campsite. We chose a spot that was a little out of the way, a couple of miles off the main road, tucked into a wooded area not too far from a small lake. We picked it specifically because it was far from other people. That was the whole point. We wanted to feel like we had the place to ourselves. And we did. When we arrived, the site was completely empty. No other tents, no parked cars, nothing. Just tall trees, dirt paths, and quiet. It was late afternoon when we finished setting up the tent. A big 6-person one that we borrowed from a friend. It was old but still solid, and it gave us plenty of space. We built a fire, cooked some food, and just sat around until it got dark. I remember how quiet it was out there. No car noises, no city sounds. Just the crackling of the fire, the occasional bird, and the wind moving through the trees. As the night went on, it got colder, and we eventually decided to head to bed. We all crammed into the tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and settled in. I laid there for a while, just listening. You'd think being in the middle of nowhere would be peaceful, but honestly, it was a little unsettling. The silence out there felt heavy, like the trees were watching us. I brushed the feeling off, figuring I was just being paranoid. I must have drifted off pretty quickly because the next thing I remember was waking up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, but it pulled me out of that light sleep, the kind where you're not fully awake but not completely out either. It was a scratching sound. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal like a raccoon or maybe a possum, but the sound didn't come from one spot. It moved. It circled the tent slowly, like something or someone was walking around us, dragging their hand or maybe a stick along the side of the fabric. The scratching was steady, not rushed, not panicked. It was deliberate. I kept my eyes closed, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination or maybe a small animal brushing against the tent. But then I heard movement from the others, shifting sleeping bags, shallow breathing, small rustling sounds. I opened my eyes and looked around. In the faint light coming from the dying campfire outside, I could see the outlines of my roommates. They were awake. I could see the tension in the way they lay still, listening just like me. The scratching continued. It moved slowly around the tent, pausing now and then continuing on the other side. It didn't feel random. It didn't feel like an animal sniffing around or rummaging for food. It felt like someone was out there, walking around us, tracing the perimeter of the tent with their fingers. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to unzip the tent and look outside. I didn't even want to sit up. I remember thinking, what am I going to do if it's a person? Confront them? Run? We were far from the road, and there was no one else out here. At least there wasn't supposed to be. I could see that my roommates were just as frozen as I was. Nobody moved to get up. Nobody said anything. I could tell they were all awake because of the way they shifted slightly, how they held their breath, how their eyes flicked toward the tent walls where the noise was coming from. But I didn't want to deal with it. I can't really explain why. It wasn't bravery or logic. It was the opposite. I was afraid. I figured if I didn't move, maybe it would go away. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe it was just a wandering animal and I was working myself up for no reason. So I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. I forced myself to stay still, to let the scratching noises blend into the background. I focused on my breathing, tried to sink back into that shallow half-sleep, and eventually, at some point, I actually did fall asleep. When I woke up again, the sun was already up. The tent was stuffy from 4 people breathing in a small space all night, and the morning air outside was crisp. The campfire had burned out completely, leaving behind only cold ash and blackened wood. It took a minute for the memories from the night before to fully come back to me. The scratching, the circling footsteps, the fear. I sat up and looked at my roommates. They looked as tired as I felt, like none of us had gotten a good night's sleep. None of us said anything right away. We all moved around slowly, getting out of our sleeping bags, stepping outside the tent into the chilly morning air. That's when we saw the footprints. They were clear in the soft dirt around the tent. They weren't ours. We had made plenty of tracks the day before, sure, but these were fresh. They circled the tent in a near-perfect loop. Someone had walked around us in the middle of the night. I walked around the tent slowly, tracing the path with my eyes. The tracks weren't just random steps, they were deliberate. The prints were spaced evenly, like the person was walking calmly, not running. There was no sign of other campsites nearby, no sign of a car pulling up during the night, no trash left behind, nothing disturbed except for the dirt around our tent. What really unsettled me was how many times the tracks circled us. It wasn't just one loop. Whoever it was had walked around our tent at least 3 or 4 times, maybe more. The circles overlapped in places, but you could follow them with your eyes, see where the person had paused and turned. It wasn't a wild animal. It wasn't some accident. Someone had been out there, walking around our tent, dragging their hand or something sharp along the fabric, circling us while we lay there, pretending to sleep. The more I looked at the tracks, the more the weight of the situation sank in. We were miles off the main road. No one else was supposed to be out here. If it was another camper, why didn't we see them arrive? Why didn't they make a fire, set up a tent, leave signs of being there? There was nothing. No wrappers, no dropped items, no cigarette butts, no tire tracks. Whoever it was had come on foot, walked around our tent for a while, and then left, leaving no other trace. We started talking in low voices, finally sharing what each of us had heard during the night. Turned out we'd all heard the scratching, the footsteps, the circling, but none of us had moved. None of us had wanted to look outside. We'd all made the same quiet decision. Let it pass. Don't react. Maybe it will go away. And it did. Whoever it was eventually walked off, and we never heard them leave. We packed up quickly that morning. None of us wanted to stay another night. The forest, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt different, like it was watching us leave. I remember walking back toward the car, scanning the trees, listening hard, half expecting to hear footsteps following us. On the drive home, we didn't talk much. There wasn't anything else to say. The situation was simple but disturbing. Someone had been out there with us in the middle of the night. They didn't try to get in the tent. They didn't make any noise to draw us out. They just walked around us, slow and steady, leaving quiet circles in the dirt. Even now, I still think about that night sometimes. I think about how vulnerable we were in that thin nylon tent, completely exposed, no walls, no locks, no real protection. It would have taken nothing for whoever was out there to slash the tent open or worse. They didn't. They just wanted to let us know they were there. It wasn't an axe murderer. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person. Someone with their own reasons. Someone who didn't need to speak or be seen to make their presence known. And that's what makes it worse. When people ask me about the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, I don't tell them ghost stories. I don't talk about accidents or near-death experiences. I tell them about that night, about the scratching, the slow footsteps, the circles in the dirt, because the scariest things are usually the ones that actually happen. The person out there made a choice. They chose to walk around our tent in the dark. They chose not to attack, not to speak, not to leave any trace beyond their footprints. They chose to let us wake up in the morning and find proof that we hadn't been dreaming. I think that's what they wanted. They wanted us to find the tracks. They wanted us to know. And that's what I remember the most. The feeling that someone had been there with us, inches away, watching while we pretended to sleep, waiting while we lay frozen in fear, leaving just enough evidence to remind us that sometimes you aren't as alone as you think you are. I went hiking and camping with a group in the Absaroka Wilderness in Wyoming once. It was one of those long trips where you pack light, carry everything on your back, and move deeper into the wilderness each day. It wasn't my first time doing a trip like that, but I had never gone this far out before. The Absaroka region is big, rough, and wild. The kind of place where you can walk for days without seeing anyone. The air smells sharp and clean, and the forests are thick with tall pine trees and rough undergrowth. The ground is uneven, scattered with rocks, tree roots, and patches of thick grass. There were 6 of us in the group. We had planned for 8 days out there, hiking from spot to spot and setting up camp each night. The first few days were normal. We stuck to known trails, kept a steady pace, and picked campsites near streams for easy water access. The weather was decent, chilly at night, warm during the day, but we knew how to handle it. One thing you get used to in places like this is seeing signs of bears. There are always signs. Scratches on tree trunks, claw marks, sometimes overturned logs where they were digging for bugs. Sometimes you see their droppings right on the trail. It's just part of being in the wilderness in Wyoming. You make noise while you hike, keep your food hung up at night, and try not to surprise anything. By the 4th day, we were deep into the woods, far past the places most weekend hikers would reach. We arrived at a campsite that looked like a good spot. There was a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream nearby for water. The site looked well used. The dirt was packed down, and there were old fire rings made from stones, the black char from past fires still visible. I noticed right away that some of the trees around the site had long claw marks running down their trunks. They were the kind of marks you see when a bear has stood up on its hind legs and scratched the bark, maybe to mark territory or to stretch. The scratches were deep and wide, spaced apart in long lines. Some of them looked fresh, with pale wood showing where the outer bark had been ripped away. We knew bears had been through the area. It didn't really surprise us. If you camp out here enough, you start to expect it. It's not something you ignore, but it's also not something you pack up and run from. You just have to be smart. Keep your food sealed, keep your distance, and always stay alert. We set up camp anyway. We pitched our tents, got water boiling, and settled in. The place was quiet, except for the sound of the stream and the wind in the trees. It was peaceful in that way only the deep wilderness can be, isolated, distant from everything. Later in the afternoon, one of the people in our group went to collect more firewood and called us over. I walked over to where they were, about 100 feet from our tents, just beyond a cluster of thick bushes. That's when we saw it. There was another campsite, but this one had been abandoned. It wasn't just an old fire ring or some scraps. It was a full campsite that looked like someone had left it suddenly and never came back. The tent was still there, but it had collapsed and was half covered by fallen pine needles and small branches. The fabric was torn in places, and it sagged, the poles broken and twisted. There was a sleeping bag on the ground, dirty and soaked through from old rain. Some of the stuffing had spilled out, and the bag was partly unzipped, lying awkwardly like someone had left it in a hurry. Scattered around were bits of clothing, socks, a jacket, a t-shirt, even one hiking boot lying on its side, the laces still tied. There was a camp stove sitting near the edge of the site, rusted and cold. A pot with dried, crusted food still clung to its sides. A plastic bowl lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. There was even a backpack, the top flap still open with some items inside. A flashlight with dead batteries, a half-empty water bottle, a folded map that had gone soft and worn from moisture. Everything was there. It looked like someone had just stepped away for a moment and never returned. But the thing that stuck with me the most was how scattered it all was. It didn't look like someone had packed up and left. It looked like the site had been torn apart, either by animals or in a rush. The tent had holes in it, but they weren't from knives or clean cuts. They were ragged tears, like claws had ripped through the fabric. The clothes weren't folded or stored. They were tossed about like they had been pulled out and dropped. There was no blood, no obvious signs of injury or a fight, just this eerie mess, like the people who camped there had left quickly, or maybe they'd been gone long enough for animals to rummage through their things. We all walked around slowly, taking in the scene. The ground was dry, and the old footprints had faded, but I could see faint depressions where someone's shoes had once stepped. It was impossible to tell how many people had been there or where they had gone. The site looked like it had been abandoned for at least a few weeks. The way the tent sagged under the weight of fallen debris, the dampness that had set into the fabric, the rust on the stove, it all suggested time had passed. But not too much time. The stuff wasn't rotted, just weathered. I started thinking about what might have happened. Maybe a bear had come through and scared them off. Maybe they left in a panic and got lost. Maybe they planned to come back and never did. The possibilities kept running through my head as I walked around the edge of the site. There were more claw marks on nearby trees, but it was hard to tell if they had been made before or after the campsite was abandoned. Bears come and go. They don't always leave clear timelines. The thing that made me uneasy was that nothing had been taken. The backpack was still there. The stove was there. Even some packaged food, though torn open by animals, had been left behind. It didn't seem like the people had packed up to leave. It felt like they had been interrupted. After a while, we drifted back to our own campsite. The mood had changed. We kept glancing at the tree line, listening harder to the sounds around us. The wind in the branches suddenly felt less peaceful, more like whispers in the distance. We built the fire bigger that night. We sat closer to it. We triple-checked that our food was hung up properly, far from our tents, out of reach of animals. I remember lying in my sleeping bag that night, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, every shifting noise from the forest. I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the abandoned site, about the sleeping bag left open on the ground, the jacket lying in the dirt, the boots still tied as if someone had slipped out of it in a rush. I kept wondering where those people went, if they made it out, if they just abandoned their stuff and kept walking, or if something had happened that we'd never know about. The next morning, we all moved with a little more urgency. No one said it, but it was clear we wanted to put distance between us and that site. As we packed up, I walked back to the abandoned camp one more time, just to take another look. It was still there, unchanged, still messy, still broken, still quiet. I stood there for a while, just looking. I tried to piece together what could have happened. Maybe it had been a bear. Maybe more than one. Maybe the campers had gone out for a walk and never came back. Maybe they'd gotten injured and abandoned their stuff. Maybe they panicked. The not knowing was the worst part. We left that morning and kept hiking for several more days. But that abandoned camp stayed in my mind the entire trip. I kept watching the trees, expecting to find more signs, more scraps of forgotten equipment, something that would explain it. But we never saw anything else. When we finally made it back to the trailhead and returned to our cars, the sense of safety slowly returned, but the questions didn't go away. I never found out what happened to the people who left that camp behind. I never found a news story, no reports, no missing persons posters. It was just something we stumbled across in the middle of nowhere, left to decay quietly in the woods. What made it stick with me was how real it all was. There was no mystery light in the sky, no weird symbols, no ghost stories. It was just a torn tent, a scattered camp, and a sleeping bag left open on the cold ground. The kind of thing that happens when people and wilderness mix and sometimes don't come out the other side. And that's what makes it scary, because whatever happened to those people wasn't some made-up story. It was real. It happened. Their stuff is still out there, slowly falling apart under the weight of the seasons. It's still there now, probably, unless someone else eventually packed it out or a forest ranger came through and cleared it. But when I think about it, when I picture that crumpled tent and that boot lying on its side, I realize how easily that could have been us. All it takes is one wrong decision, one bad encounter, and the forest will quietly swallow you whole, leaving only scattered equipment and silent questions for the next group to find. That's the thing about places like the Absaroka Wilderness. They're beautiful, but they don't care about you. You can follow every safety rule, do everything right, and still disappear out there without a trace. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone like me will come along and find what you left behind and wonder. Last summer, my boyfriend and I decided to take a break from the noise of everyday life and go on a camping trip. We didn't want the usual crowded campgrounds where people park their campers close to each other like sardines. We wanted something quieter, something more natural. We found a place that allowed wild camping. It was on private land, but the owners were fine with people setting up wherever they liked, as long as they were respectful and didn't cause damage. We arrived in the afternoon around 2 or 3 o'clock. The place was beautiful, thick woods, tall trees, soft grass, and narrow dirt paths that seemed to twist endlessly through the forest. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. There was no one else around when we set up our tent. The owners had a farmhouse about a kilometer away, but out here we felt completely alone. We set up our tent near a small clearing, just big enough to make a fire and lay out our chairs. The sun was warm, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional buzz of insects. It was exactly what we were looking for. After we finished setting up, we walked around a bit, exploring the trails. At one point, we saw a car drive past us on one of the dirt tracks that led deeper into the woods. It was a beat-up SUV with a couple of people inside. They didn't stop or even look at us. They just kept going. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured maybe they were just other campers looking for their own spot. We didn't see or hear anyone else for the rest of the afternoon. As evening rolled in, we got the fire going and cooked dinner. The quiet was nice, but by now the woods had taken on that dense, heavy silence that comes when night falls in the middle of nowhere. The trees seemed darker, the shadows longer, but still it was peaceful in its own way. We stayed by the fire, talking, drinking, and enjoying the calm night. There was no phone signal out there, but I didn't mind. Sometimes it's good to really disconnect. It was just past midnight when everything changed. At first, I thought I imagined it. There was this low groaning sound, so deep and heavy it almost blended into the background. It started far off, somewhere in the distance. I paused, listening, but my boyfriend hadn't heard it. I let it go, thinking maybe it was the wind pushing through the trees. But then it came again, louder this time, and with it, a strange sobbing sound. Not like someone sniffling or quietly crying. It was loud, painful, like whoever it was had completely lost control of themselves. The groaning turned into full-on crying. The man's sobs echoed in the silence, and I could hear his voice break and shatter as he wailed. My body went cold. The sound wasn't steady. It would grow loud and desperate, then fade away into the woods like he was moving, only to come back again, closer, louder, like he was circling the area. Between the cries and groans, there were these strange thumping sounds. Heavy, solid thuds like someone hitting the ground hard with their fists or maybe their knees. My heart started racing. I didn't know what was happening, but it felt wrong. The crying was the worst part. It sounded so raw, so broken. It wasn't the kind of crying that people do when they're just upset. It was the kind of sound that comes from people who are completely falling apart. And then sometimes there were these sharp, high-pitched screams that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like someone trying to scare others. It sounded real. It sounded like pain. The sounds kept going, sometimes near, sometimes far, but never stopping. 5 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but when you're sitting in the middle of the woods, in total darkness except for the small circle of firelight, 5 minutes of that kind of screaming feels like forever. I felt trapped. I wanted to move, to do something, but I didn't know what. My brain was racing through possibilities. Was someone hurt? Were they being attacked? Was there some kind of accident? But if it was that, why wasn't there any shouting for help? Why weren't there any other voices? It was just him. Just that one man crying and screaming in the dark. I looked at my boyfriend and I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. We were both sitting there frozen, listening, trying to figure out what to do. The owners of the campsite were over a kilometer away, and we had no phones that worked out here. If we went to them, we'd be leaving the safety of the fire and heading out into the woods in the direction where the sounds were coming from. We weren't sure what was out there. Could it be an animal? Could someone be playing a sick joke? But it didn't sound like a joke. And if it was a person, what were they doing, screaming like that alone in the woods at midnight? I started thinking about the car we saw earlier, the beat-up SUV with the people inside. They had driven past our camp hours ago, going deeper into the woods. Maybe they were connected to this. Maybe something had gone very wrong with their group. Maybe they were in trouble. Or maybe they were the ones causing the trouble. The sounds weren't getting closer, but they weren't going away either. They just seemed to move in and out, like the man was pacing or staggering around. We couldn't just sit there anymore. I felt too exposed, sitting by the fire in the open, like whatever was out there could see us. We grabbed the only weapon we had, a camping knife, and rushed to the car. I remember my hands shaking as I tried to jam the keys into the door. I was breathing so hard I thought I might pass out. Finally, we got inside and locked all the doors. Sitting in the car felt safer, but not by much. The woods were still all around us. The sounds continued for a little longer, but slowly they began to fade, the groaning and crying drifting further into the distance until finally everything went quiet. The silence after it stopped was just as terrifying. We didn't know if whoever it was had actually left or if they were still out there, just waiting. We sat in the car for what felt like an hour, too scared to go back to the tent, too on edge to relax. Eventually, we decided to text the owners. Luckily, we had a tiny bit of signal from the car, just enough to get a message through. They came up to our campsite not long after. It was two of them, both middle-aged, both calm but a little concerned when we told them what we'd heard. They didn't seem shocked, though. They listened carefully and then told us that they knew who it probably was. Apparently, the group in the SUV came to this area every summer. They were part of some kind of spiritual retreat. They would camp deep in the woods, away from everyone else, and do these intense, cleansing rituals. The owners had heard about them before and said the group wasn't dangerous, but their rituals could get loud and sometimes pretty strange. They said what we'd heard was probably one of their sessions, someone going through a particularly emotional part of their process. That was it. There wasn't some hidden threat. There wasn't anyone out there trying to scare us or hurt us. It was just some guy getting cleansed in the middle of the night in a way that sounded, to outsiders like us, like pure terror. Even though the explanation made sense, the fear didn't disappear right away. We ended up spending the rest of the night sleeping in the car. Neither of us wanted to go back to the tent, even though the owners told us everything was fine. I didn't care. The sounds I'd heard were too real, too raw. I knew it wasn't an emergency, but the fear still clung to me like a heavy coat. The next morning, the woods were peaceful again. The birds were singing, the sun was out, and everything looked normal. But it didn't feel normal to me. I kept thinking about that man's screams, about how it had sounded like his whole world was falling apart. It didn't matter that I now knew it wasn't dangerous. That sound had burned itself into my memory. We packed up quickly that morning and left the campsite. On the way out, we passed the path where the SUV had gone the day before. I didn't see anyone from the group, but I wondered what their retreat was really like. I wondered if they knew how terrifying they sounded to the people camping nearby. That was the last time we ever went wild camping. After that, we stuck to more popular campgrounds where there were plenty of people around. Even if it meant less quiet, at least there was less chance of running into something that sounded like that again. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones that mean you harm. Sometimes it's just the things you don't understand. The things that sound like a nightmare but aren't. The things that leave you sitting in your car, clutching a knife, waiting for the screaming to stop. That night stuck with me, not because we were ever in real danger, but because I learned how thin the line is between safety and terror. One moment you're sitting by a peaceful campfire, the next you're running for your car, your heart pounding, because you've heard something you can't explain. It was a mistake anyone could make, and it changed the way I think about being alone in the woods forever. There's something strange about fear. Not the regular kind, not the kind you get when you almost fall or when you see something dangerous. I mean that deep, sudden, crushing fear that comes out of nowhere. The kind that makes no sense. The kind that shows up when everything around you seems completely normal, but something inside you says, "No, this isn't right." It's a kind of fear that doesn't always stick around. Sometimes it hits you hard, disappears just as fast, and leaves you wondering if it was ever real. I didn't really understand that feeling until it happened to me. I thought I knew fear before that. Times when I was nearly in car accidents, or when I thought I'd lost someone, or when I was stuck in a dangerous place, but those times were different. Those were real-world dangers, problems you could see and name. This was something else, something that didn't fit. It happened during a solo camping trip I took last year. I've always liked going camping alone. Some people think that's weird, but for me, it's peaceful. It's quiet in a way that's hard to find anywhere else. You can hear the wind moving through the trees, the leaves crunching under your boots, and nothing else. No traffic, no people, just nature. I went to a forest I'd never camped in before, somewhere a few hours from home. It wasn't a national park or anything official. It was just open land where people could camp freely if they cleaned up after themselves. I had read a few posts online saying it was a good place to get away from everything. When I arrived, I didn't see anyone else. There were no other tents, no cars parked along the dirt road. Nothing. The place was so quiet it almost made me second-guess stopping there. But that's what I had wanted: space, distance, quiet. I parked my car off a narrow trail, hiked in about a kilometer, and found a nice flat spot near some tall pines. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a fire later. I spent the afternoon walking through the woods, breathing in the clean air, and just letting myself relax. I saw a couple of deer, a few squirrels, and heard birds calling out in the trees. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the sun felt warm on my face. It was a perfect day. I had no phone signal out there, which was fine by me. That was part of the point. Sometimes it's good to go somewhere where no one can reach you. I made dinner over the fire and sat back in my chair, listening to the sounds of the forest winding down as the sun dropped behind the trees. It was one of those evenings where you feel completely at peace. The fire crackled softly, the sky slowly filled with stars, and the air cooled just enough to feel crisp. I stayed up late, just watching the flames and enjoying the silence. There was no rush to sleep, no need to check the time. I didn't think anything of it when I heard faint noises in the distance. They were so soft at first I wasn't sure if I was imagining them. A kind of low, steady thumping. It could have been anything. Branches falling, animals moving around, maybe someone chopping wood far away. I didn't feel worried. Forests make noises, especially at night, but the thumping didn't stop. It would fade, then come back, steady and slow, like a heartbeat. Then I started hearing something else, a kind of hum. It wasn't loud, just a soft, vibrating sound that seemed to move between the trees. Came and went, sometimes blending into the background noise. I started to feel a little uneasy, not because it was necessarily dangerous, but because the sounds didn't match anything I could name. The thumping wasn't random like branches falling. It had rhythm. The hum wasn't a single sound. It wavered, almost like voices singing without words. I sat still by the fire, listening carefully, trying to figure out what it could be. After a while, the hum stopped, but the thumping continued. It was closer now, though I couldn't tell how close. Sound in the forest is tricky, can carry far or seem near when it's not. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just distant campers, maybe some other people I hadn't seen earlier. But then the air changed. I can't explain it fully. It wasn't a smell, it wasn't the temperature. It just felt heavier, like the woods had settled into some kind of waiting state. Even the insects stopped buzzing. I noticed it because the silence felt too perfect. It wasn't natural. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. I couldn't see anything. The fire threw out its small circle of light, but beyond that, there was only darkness. The thumping had stopped by now, but I had the sense that something was out there, watching. The fear didn't hit me all at once. It crept in, wrapping itself around me in small pieces, starting as a bit of nervousness and growing into full-blown panic. My brain was scrambling to make sense of it. Was it an animal? People? Should I call out? Should I pack up and leave? But I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, breathing too fast. Then, somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a single sharp cry. It wasn't a scream, not really. It was too short, too sudden, like a single word shouted by someone who was in pain. But it wasn't followed by anything else. Just that one cry, cutting through the silence. Then nothing. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to leave immediately, but the fire felt like the only thing keeping me safe. I didn't know where the sound had come from. Could have been anywhere. And I knew that if I started moving through the woods at night with just my headlamp, I would be completely exposed. I stayed near the fire for a long time, straining my ears, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. The thumping didn't return. The hum didn't return. The cry never came back. Slowly, the normal forest sounds drifted back in. The soft rustling of leaves, the chirping of night insects, the distant calls of owls. It was as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had. I didn't feel safe anymore, but I also didn't feel in immediate danger. It was a strange, confusing state to be in. I knew I wasn't ready to sleep, not after that. So I kept the fire going and sat in my chair, gripping my camping knife tightly, my headlamp shining into the dark. Hours passed. Nothing else happened. The fear didn't stay, but it didn't fully leave either. I eventually crawled into the tent just before dawn, too exhausted to keep my eyes open any longer. The next morning, the forest looked completely ordinary again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds flitted around the branches, and everything seemed as peaceful as it had the day before. I walked around the area, checked the trails, looked for signs of other campers or animals, but I found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no marks on the ground. Nothing that could explain what I'd heard. I packed up quickly that morning. I didn't feel like staying another night. As I hiked back to my car, the weight in my chest slowly lifted. It was almost as if that thick, heavy feeling was tied to that one place. As I put more distance between me and the campsite, the fear loosened its grip. When I got back to town, I went online and searched for anything I could find about the area. I found a few old posts, some people talking about hearing strange noises in those woods, but nothing specific. Some mentioned hearing singing, drums, odd cries at night. Others said it was probably people doing private rituals, maybe spiritual retreats, maybe something personal that wasn't meant to be shared. That explanation makes sense, but somehow it doesn't settle me. Could have been people. Probably was people. Maybe a small group doing some kind of ritual in the woods. Something loud, something strange to outsiders but meaningful to them. That's the most likely answer. But even knowing that, the fear I felt didn't go away. It wasn't about danger. It was about that moment when something doesn't belong, when the world suddenly feels too thin, when a crack seems to open just wide enough for something else to get through. The feeling didn't stay long. It appeared suddenly, hit me with full force, and vanished just as quickly, like it was never there. But it left a mark. The next time I went camping, I stuck to more crowded places. Campgrounds with other people around, where the sounds you hear at night are cars starting, zippers opening, people whispering in their tents. I haven't been back to that forest. I probably never will. It's strange how some fears don't need an explanation. It doesn't really matter whether it was a ritual, whether it was people or something else. What matters is that feeling, that cold, heavy fear that wraps around you out of nowhere, reminds you how small you are, and then slips away as if it was never there. But I know it was. I'll always know, and that's enough to keep me from going back. I was around 17 when this happened. It was back when I still lived on my parents' farm, a big property in the countryside. The farm stretched out for hundreds of acres, mostly open paddocks, some thick bushland, and a wide river that curved along the far boundary. It wasn't unusual for me to camp down by the river. I'd done it plenty of times, usually with friends, sometimes on my own. The spot we always used was quiet and pretty isolated from the rest of the property. You couldn't see the house from there, and it was about 2 kilometers away, across uneven ground and winding dirt tracks. On this particular night, I was camping with one of my good mates. It wasn't anything special, just a simple night out by the river, with a fire, some snacks, and a bit of fishing planned for the next morning. We set up our tent about 10 meters back from the fire pit, close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough that the light didn't shine straight into the tent. It was cool but not too cold, just one of those quiet, crisp nights where the air feels clean and every sound carries a little further. As we sat by the fire, the only noises we heard were the usual ones. Crickets, the occasional splash from the river, the distant call of frogs. The place felt calm, and we weren't thinking about much other than enjoying the night. After a while, we called it and climbed into the tent. We zipped up the door, kicked off our boots, and lay down in our sleeping bags. It was peaceful, the fire outside still crackling low. It must have been about an hour later when I started hearing the noises. First, it was faint, like sticks snapping. Then I heard footsteps moving through the dry leaves. They weren't coming from the direction of the river or the open paddock. They were from the bushland that sat behind us, the part of the property where the trees got thicker and the ground was uneven. It wasn't uncommon for kangaroos or wombats to wander nearby at night, so I didn't think much of it right away. But then I noticed the rhythm of the footsteps. They weren't quick, scattered animal steps. They sounded careful, slow, and deliberate, like someone was trying to stay quiet, but the dry ground was giving them away. I lay there listening. I assumed it was probably my sister and her friends trying to scare us. They'd been home when we left earlier that evening, and knowing them, they would have thought it was funny to sneak down and mess with us. They'd done stuff like that before, leaving spooky noises or hiding near the tent to try and freak us out. I brushed it off at first, but the steps didn't stop. They kept circling like whoever it was waiting for us to react. After a few more minutes, the sounds stopped. I figured they'd given up or gone quiet to mess with us. I unzipped the tent door just a little to peek out. I didn't expect to see anything. I really thought they'd be gone. But when I looked out, I saw someone standing there, right near the fire. They weren't moving. They were standing just at the edge of the firelight, close enough that I could make out the shape but not the details. I could tell it was a person, not an animal, not a trick of the light. They were just standing there, facing our tent. I stared at them, trying to figure out who it was. I thought maybe it was my sister's boyfriend or one of her mates. I kept watching, waiting for them to move or say something, but they didn't. They just stood there, still and silent. Then they must have realized I was looking at them, because they suddenly turned and ran, fast, straight into the thick scrub behind the campsite. I heard them crashing through the branches, the sound growing fainter as they disappeared into the trees. They weren't running toward the house or toward the road. They ran deeper into the bush, toward the rough parts of the property that weren't cleared or used. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. It didn't feel like something my sister and her friends would bother with, especially not with the way that person reacted. I didn't want to stay there, I didn't want to wait around for them to come back or try something else. Without wasting time, I threw on my boots and got out of the tent. My mate didn't argue. He must have been thinking the same thing. We didn't even pack up our gear. We just got on the quad bike and rode straight for the house, leaving the tent and the fire behind. The ride back was about 2 kilometers, across bumpy tracks, through gates, and past open paddocks. It wasn't a short ride, but we made good time, pushing the quad bike faster than usual because neither of us wanted to hang around down there. When we got back to the house, we walked inside and found my sister and her friends sitting in the living room, watching a movie. They were relaxed, completely unaware of what had just happened. They hadn't gone anywhere. They'd been there the whole time, which was confirmed later when we talked to everyone else. There was no way they could have been down by the river. Even if they tried to mess with us and race back to the house, we would have passed them on the track, and there just wasn't enough time for them to beat us back. At that moment, I realized whoever I'd seen wasn't one of them. I tried to make sense of it. I went over all the possibilities in my head. Could it have been someone from a nearby property? Maybe someone hunting illegally? But it didn't really make sense. The neighbors lived kilometers away. People didn't just wander through our land, especially not at night. The farm was fenced, and there weren't any roads or walking tracks near that part of the river. Strangers didn't show up randomly like that. I also thought about the way that person reacted. If they were just lost, they wouldn't have been standing silently near our campfire, watching our tent. They would have called out, asked for directions, or walked into the light. This person wanted to stay hidden until I saw them. The second they realized I was watching, they took off like they knew they shouldn't be there. It wasn't like they just stumbled across our campsite by accident. They had to walk across part of the property, past fences and through rough ground to get to that spot. And they didn't approach from the obvious direction like someone coming from the road would. They came from deep in the bush, a part of the property most people avoided because it was overgrown and hard to move through. After that night, I didn't camp down by the river again, at least not for a long time. I kept thinking about who that person could have been and what they were doing out there. I went back the next day to get our gear, and I checked around the area, looking for footprints or signs of someone hanging around, but the ground was rough, and I couldn't find anything clear. There were some disturbed leaves and broken twigs, but that was it. I followed a faint path where they ran off, but it didn't lead to anything. It just disappeared into thicker bush. I told my parents about it, and they took it seriously. They checked the fences, made sure the gates were locked, and kept an eye out for a few days. But there were no signs of anyone else. No vehicles, no more noises at night. Nothing went missing from the sheds. It was like whoever it was had just passed through and left. But that's the part that still bothers me. People don't usually just pass through a farm like ours, especially not in the middle of the night. It's hard to get in without being noticed, and even harder to get out quickly. It wasn't someone trying to steal something from the house. That would have been the other direction, toward the sheds and garages. This person was out by the river, away from everything else. I sometimes wonder if they'd been watching us for a while before I saw them. Maybe they were already out there when we set up the tent. Maybe they were waiting to see if we'd fall asleep before doing something else. I try not to think too hard about what their plan might have been if I hadn't looked out when I did. I know there are people who squat on rural properties, sometimes even set up illegal camps or hide out for days, but I never found any trace of that. No campsites, no gear, no litter, just that one person who disappeared as quickly as they'd come. Could have been a drifter, someone passing through who just happened to stumble across us. Or maybe they'd been there before we arrived and didn't expect anyone else to be camping there. Maybe they had their own reasons for being in that part of the bush, reasons I probably don't want to know. But the fact that they ran the moment I saw them sticks with me. It didn't feel like a curious passerby. It felt like someone who knew they shouldn't be there. That night changed the way I thought about the farm. Before that, it had always felt like a safe place, familiar and comfortable. I grew up there. I knew every track, every paddock, every corner. But after that, I realized that even out there, far from town, far from the usual roads, you can still run into things that don't make sense. You can still find people who don't belong, people you can't explain. It's been years since then, but I still remember every part of that night. The quiet steps, the figure by the fire, the way they bolted into the scrub without a word, and the cold knot in my stomach when I realized that it couldn't have been my sister or anyone from the house. I'll never know who I saw that night, but I know they saw me, and that's enough to keep me from camping by that river again. I've always thought raccoons were kind of funny. The way they walk, the way their little hands mess with things, and the dark fur around their eyes that makes them look like tiny burglars. There's something comical about them, something almost charming from a distance. But when you actually have to deal with them, when you actually face them up close, the charm disappears pretty quickly. Where I live, the animals that get into the trash are usually foxes. Foxes are sneaky, but not very persistent. If you put your trash in a closed bin, they usually leave it alone. Sometimes they'll sniff around, maybe tip it over if the lid is loose, but they'll give up pretty quickly. I used to think raccoons would be about the same. I used to think they were mostly just funny little bandits, clumsy and cute. I don't think that anymore. Last summer, I went on a solo camping trip deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. I've always liked going alone. I know some people think it's risky, but I enjoy the quiet, the freedom, and the space to just be by myself. No one talking, no one asking me to do things. Just me and the forest. I chose a spot near a small stream, not far from an old, disused trail. It was a quiet area, not popular, which is exactly why I liked it. The first couple of nights were peaceful. I spent the days hiking around, fishing a little, sitting by the fire in the evenings. I brought plenty of food, carefully packed, and I was always pretty careful about storing it properly. I've camped enough to know that animals can smell food from a long way off. I had one of those heavy-duty camping bins with a latch that's supposed to be animal-resistant. Not bear-proof, but tough enough to keep out smaller animals. I stored all my food and trash in there and kept it about 20 feet away from my tent, just to be safe. I'd even tie it down with a strap when I could, something I started doing after I once found raccoon paw prints all over my cooler years ago. The first sign of trouble came on the third night. I was lying in my tent, just listening to the woods. There were a few distant noises, crickets, the soft rush of the stream, the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. I remember thinking how quiet it was compared to the first 2 nights. Then I heard something else, something closer, a faint scraping sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't like a branch rubbing against another or leaves moving. It was more rhythmic, more purposeful. A scraping like something was rubbing or scratching against a hard surface. At first, I thought maybe it was a fox. They'd probably smelled the food and were nosing around. I wasn't too worried. I figured they'd sniff around and leave when they couldn't get into the bin. I almost didn't even get up, but the sound kept going. It wasn't the quick, frustrated scratching I'd expect from a fox giving up after a minute. It was steady, determined. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and poked my head out with my flashlight. I shined the beam toward the bin, and sure enough, there was a raccoon sitting on top of it. It looked at me for a second, blinking in the light, and then went right back to what it was doing, working its little hands along the latch. I'd seen videos of raccoons opening latches, but I'd never really believed they could figure out the kinds of locks I used. I got out and walked over, clapping my hands. The raccoon didn't even flinch. I waved my arms, stomped my feet, made noise, but the animal barely reacted. Finally, after I came within a few feet, it gave me one last look and waddled off into the trees. I checked the bin. The strap was still tight, the latch still closed. I figured I'd scared it off for good, but that wasn't the end of it. The next night, it came back. I heard the same sound, scraping, tugging, quiet but constant. I stepped out again with my flashlight, and this time there were 3 raccoons. One was on the ground, one was tugging on the strap, and another was sitting on top of the bin working at the latch again. I chased them off, but they were even slower to leave this time. It was like they weren't really afraid of me. That unsettled me a bit, but I told myself I just had to be more aggressive about securing my food. The following morning, I took extra care. I double-checked the strap, tightened it as much as I could, and even set some rocks on top of the bin for good measure. I also moved it farther away from my tent, maybe 30 or 40 feet this time. I didn't want to spend the whole night listening to them scratch around. That night, the sounds came back. Scraping, tugging, clawing. But this time, there was something else. A faint tapping sound, almost like something hard was knocking against the plastic bin. It was rhythmic, like they were testing the sides. When I stepped out of the tent and shined my light, I counted at least 5 raccoons. They scattered a little, but not far. A couple of them stayed right at the edge of the light, watching me. It was strange how bold they were. I clapped, stomped, even threw a couple of sticks, but they kept their distance and didn't really leave. I dragged the bin even farther away, all the way to the edge of the stream, thinking the moving water and the distance would discourage them. They didn't follow me when I moved it, but I could see their little eyes reflecting in the dark, still watching from the trees. I lay in my tent for hours that night, listening. The scraping came back, followed by a series of loud bangs. I realized they were tipping the bin over and slamming it against the rocks. I got up again, ran over, and they scattered, but this time they'd managed to loosen one side of the strap. I tightened it again, but I started to worry they weren't going to give up. The next morning, I found little wet handprints all over the bin, like they'd been dipping their paws in the stream and then working at the latch with wet hands. The bin was scuffed, scratched, and dented from where they'd knocked it around. I thought about packing up and heading out early, but I still had food left and wanted to finish the trip. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. I figured I'd outsmart them. That afternoon, I set up a more secure system. I used my rope to suspend the bin from a tree branch, hanging it about 6 feet off the ground. It wasn't perfect. I didn't have the right kind of pulley or gear for a proper bear hang, but it was high enough that I didn't think the raccoons could reach it. I tied the rope tightly around the branch and then tied the loose end to the base of the tree, pulling the bin out toward the middle of the branch where it would be hardest to reach. I felt pretty good about that setup. I cooked dinner, cleaned up carefully, and made sure not to leave any scraps or food smells near my tent. That night, I lay awake, listening. The scraping came again, but it was farther away this time, which I expected. I figured they'd sniff around, realize they couldn't reach the bin, and leave. But the scraping didn't stop. It got louder. Then there was a thud. Then another thud. I heard something smacking against the tree. I heard more noises, rustling, something dragging. When I finally got up to check, I couldn't believe what I saw. The raccoons had dragged over a fallen branch, a long one, and were trying to prop it against the tree to climb. I don't know if it was on purpose or if they were just pushing things around, but the way it was positioned looked deliberate. One raccoon was climbing the branch as I approached, trying to reach the hanging bin. I chased them off again, but they didn't go far. That night was miserable. Every time I dozed off, I'd wake up to the sound of them working on something. I heard scratching, tapping, dragging, thumping over and over. I'd shine my light out, see their eyes in the dark, and they'd scurry just far enough to wake me out. By morning, I was exhausted. The bin was still hanging, but it had shifted closer to the trunk somehow, and there were fresh scratches on the bark where they tried to climb. I couldn't figure out how they were managing it, but it was clear they weren't going to give up. I packed up that day, cutting my trip short. I didn't want to deal with another night of it. I was tired, irritated, and honestly, a little creeped out by how persistent they'd been. I've camped in bear country. I've dealt with foxes, coyotes, even the occasional bold deer. I've never had an animal so relentlessly focused on getting my food like those raccoons were. I always thought of them as goofy little burglars, but they were much more serious than I gave them credit for. When I got home, I kept thinking about it. I started reading about raccoons, about how smart they really are. I learned that they have excellent memory, that they can remember solutions to problems for years, that their dexterous little hands are almost as good as ours in some ways. I read about how urban raccoons have started solving complex locks and even working together to open containers. I used to think I was lucky that we mostly had foxes at home getting into the trash. Now I realize that's more true than I thought. Foxes give up. Foxes are thwarted by a simple bin with a lid. Raccoons are not. I still see them sometimes, when I'm walking through the neighborhood in the evening. I see them waddling along fences or darting across the street. I can't look at them the same way anymore. They still look like little burglars, but I don't find it funny now. Because I know if they really want something, they'll get it. They won't stop. They'll come back again and again until they find a way in. And the worst part is they don't fear you. They just wait you out. And now, whenever I take out the trash at night, I'm grateful it's just foxes rooting around out there. Because foxes give up. Raccoons don't. I've always liked camping alone. Some people don't understand that. They tell me it's dangerous or boring, but I don't see it that way. I like the quiet. I like being out in the woods with no one else around. It gives me time to think. It helps me clear my head. Last fall, I planned a 3-day solo camping trip in a state forest in upstate New York. I didn't pick one of the official campgrounds. I found a spot about 5 miles off a side trail, near a small lake. I'd been there once before with a friend a few years earlier, so I knew the area. It was far enough that I wouldn't see anyone, and there weren't any ranger stations nearby. That's what I wanted. Just space to myself, quiet mornings, quiet nights, hiking and sitting by the fire. I went over the checklist like I always do. Tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, water filter, emergency beacon, first aid kit. I packed light but made sure I had everything I needed. I drove to the trailhead early on a Friday morning. The parking lot was empty, which I expected. It was late in the season, a bit too cold for most people to be out. The air was crisp, the trees almost bare, and the ground was covered in dry leaves. The hike in was peaceful. I followed the main trail for a couple of miles, then took the small, overgrown path that led toward the lake. The path was narrow and a little hard to follow in places, but I'd been there before and I recognized the turns. It took me about 3 hours to reach the spot. The lake was calm and still, reflecting the gray sky. I found the little clearing near the shore where I'd camped before. There was still a half-burnt fire ring from my last trip. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and spent the rest of the day walking around the lake, taking pictures and just enjoying the quiet. No signs of people, no fresh tracks on the trail. It was exactly what I wanted. That night, I cooked dinner over the small fire I built. I ate slowly, watching the flames as the light faded from the sky. The stars came out and the wind died down, and it felt like I was the only person for miles. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the woods around me. Dry leaves rustling, small branches falling, the occasional hoot of an owl. I finally put the fire out, made sure everything was cleaned up, and crawled into my tent for the night. It was cold, but my sleeping bag was warm, and I fell asleep quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the dry leaves. I lay still, listening carefully. It's normal to hear animals walking around at night. Deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. The sound didn't immediately alarm me. It was probably just something sniffing around, maybe checking out where I'd been sitting. But then the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just listened, my heart starting to beat a little faster. There was no snuffling, no scratching, no animal sounds. Just footsteps, slow, steady steps. I could hear the leaves crushing under each one. It's not common to run into other people when you're this far out. Possible, but not common. Most people stick to the main trails or the established campgrounds. I stayed still, holding my breath. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I waited, listening. After a few minutes, the sound moved away, back into the woods. I didn't get up. I just lay there, wide awake, listening to every small sound until the morning light came through the fabric of my tent. When I finally got up and stepped outside, the first thing I did was check the area around the tent. I saw them right away. Footprints in the soft dirt and crushed leaves. Human footprints. They circled the tent just like I'd heard. I followed them for a short distance toward the trees, but they disappeared quickly once the ground got harder. I looked around for a long time, trying to see if anyone was nearby, but I didn't see anyone. I don't scare easily, but I couldn't explain why someone would be out there that late, that far from any trail, just walking around my tent. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or another camper passing through. I didn't see any signs of other campsites, but maybe someone was just moving through the area. I almost packed up and left right then, but the sky was clear, the lake was calm, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, so I stayed. The second day was quiet. I hiked around the lake, stayed alert, but saw no one. No movement, no fresh tracks, just the usual forest animals. By evening, I felt calmer. I built another fire, cooked dinner, and watched the sun set again. It was still cold, but not too bad once I was close to the fire. As it got darker, I felt myself relaxing again. I probably just spooked myself the night before. Maybe it was nothing. When I finally crawled into my tent again, I made sure everything was packed up tight. My food was sealed and stored away, my fire was out, and my flashlight was next to my sleeping bag. I drifted off, but it wasn't deep sleep. I kept waking up, listening to the woods. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, crunching through the leaves, slow and steady, getting closer. I held my breath, waiting. The steps came right up to the tent again, just like the night before. But this time, they didn't circle. They stopped right by the entrance to the tent. I could hear breathing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I kept thinking I should grab my flashlight, but I didn't want to make any noise. Then I heard something else. The quiet sound of a zipper being touched. Not unzipped, just the sound of fingers brushing the zipper pull. Then silence. After a long time, the footsteps slowly moved away. I lay there wide awake for hours. When the sun came up, I got out and looked around again. The footprints were back. They led right up to the entrance of my tent. I could see where someone had been standing. The zipper was untouched, but there were faint smudges on it, like dirt from someone's hand. This time, I didn't wait around. I packed everything quickly and started the long hike back to my car. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps. I didn't hear anything else, didn't see anyone. When I got back to the parking lot, my car was the only one there. That stuck with me. The lot was still empty. No other cars. No signs that anyone else had been out there. I tried to figure out how that could be. Maybe someone else parked somewhere else. Maybe someone had been out there for a long time and was camped even farther in. But it didn't make sense. I keep thinking about the way the footsteps came at night. Slow, steady, not in a hurry. Like whoever it was knew I was there and wasn't afraid. The way they stood right outside the tent, just breathing. The way they touched the zipper but didn't open it. It was like they wanted me to know they were there. Like they wanted me to hear them. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. I didn't lose anything, nothing was taken. But I know I wasn't alone out there. And now, when I camp, I still go alone. But I stay closer to marked trails, closer to other people. I don't go so deep anymore, because some people don't need to scare you to hurt you. Some people don't need to talk to you or threaten you. Sometimes all they need to do is show you they can reach you whenever they want. And that's enough.